was 14, I stayed out one night. Oh, mama.
From where you're sitting, looking at the world right now, this country with Trump and the Republican Party every day, could you have predicted this? I mean, it seems like something out of a bad novel or a bad TV show.
I did not predict Trump, but for the last 25 years, I've been worried with increasing vehemence about the widening divide in this country between a majority losing economic security and losing ground, and a small minority gaining most of the benefits of economic growth. And in the 1990s, when I was Secretary of Labor, I began to specifically talk about the rise of a series of demagogues who would use fear and anxiety and channel it to scapegoats such as immigrants, African Americans, and other minorities in the United States, and divide the country in order to enhance their power. I did a movie about this a few years ago called Saving Capitalism, and before that a movie called Inequality For All, and a few books. The centerpiece of both the movies and the books is this pending fear of authoritarianism as the alternative to democratic small d populism.
How do we do a better job of explaining to the public about the concept of this being a kleptocracy and how in this moment, the way that capitalism and democracy increasingly seem to be incompatible, this version of capitalism?
I think it's very important to emphasize with the public that we are at an inflection point, and a very dangerous one, and in which great wealth at the top in a relatively few hands is incompatible with democracy. This is not the first time that this has happened. Louis Brandeis, the great jurist, said in the 1920s, as we were coming out of the Gilded Age, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. We made a decision at the end of the Gilded Age to revive democracy, and that we called, in hindsight, the Progressive Era and then the New Deal. But I think that my generation, that is the baby boomers, took our democratic system pretty much for granted. Our first real experience with politics was the Civil Rights Movement, and that was an affirmative experience. But the next experience was the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's lies, and that turned many of us quite cynical. The last 40 years has been a time of testing. Can we keep our democracy when the median wage has barely risen and a large portion of the gains from economic growth have gone to the top? I don't think we can, if that's going to be the trajectory we're on over the next decades.
Now, you mentioned earlier inflection points, and so many things are converging in terms of system shocks right now. We have elite overproduction. On the other end of the spectrum, thinking about the quote-unquote white working class in America, other folks around the world who feel alienated by globalization. And it seems like those two factors have converged to create this disenchantment and this rage. And my concern is, what does that do to the system going forward when we have these push-pull factors? Never mind automation and the failures of neoliberalism, but we're getting it from the top and also from the bottom, this discontent.
I think there are two forms of populism. One is authoritarian. And we've seen this before in history. When large numbers of people are fearful, demagogues emerge who pretend that they are the champions of the masses, and they pick on certain minorities as the anxieties. Trump has chosen immigrants and forces outside the United States, but he has also gone after black athletes and supported indirectly white supremacists and really fueled the ugliest kinds of divisiveness in the United States. The other kind of populism we might call democratic, small d, populism. I think that in 2016, Bernie Sanders represented that alternative. And it really is, at this stage, the only practical alternative to authoritarian populism. It stands for fundamental reform of our political and economic system. Not just political system. It also requires fundamental economic reform, because the two are intimately related. You can't reform our political system until you reform the economy. And one of the deepest problems of the economy is that there are so many hidden upward redistributions from the poor and middle class to the wealthy that people don't see because they're buried in the new rules of the game, buried in laws and regulations that have been installed by wealthy interests, including big corporations, very wealthy individuals.
But in terms of exposing those connections, I'm thinking, you literally just wrote a piece about this. Look at the Republican Party and its extreme drift over the last few decades, where if you're thinking about rent-seeking behavior and these big corporations that are literally gaming the system, in so many ways, it's antithetical, really, to capitalism. They claim to love free markets. Well, these markets aren't free. Neoliberalism is socialism for rich people and free markets for everybody else. And Republicans love to complain in their Fox News talking point types about the boogeyman is socialism and Bernie Sanders. Well, they want state subsidies and they want protection for the very rich, but not for anybody else.
Well, they've been talking this way for 85 years. They opposed Franklin D. Roosevelt's plan for Social Security by calling it socialism. They opposed John F. Kennedy's ideas for economic development as socialism. They opposed Lyndon Johnson's Medicare as socialism. The right has called socialism anything that helps average working people. It's deeper than that. The actual rules and regulations and laws that the wealthy are increasingly